Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hey, Kate.
Hi, I guess it's that time again.
Yes, it is. And it's almost July. We've blown away another half year here at Shattered Reality Podcast.
Time goes fast when
And
you're having fun.
It is actually June 28th, 2016.
Yes.
And I am just back from the very, very fascinating and interesting Society for Scientific Exploration, the symposium, which was held in Denver, Colorado during the past week. And boy, were there some interesting people there. And I think I've corralled several interesting guests, as well as two of our previous guests who were there who would be happy to come back on again. Cool. So that is really good news for us. But today, we have a really, really fascinating lady who is a very well-read and meticulously kind of researched author here. She has written fiction, and she has written a lot of translations from Spanish to English, very well translated, I might add. And so today we are going to welcome the Flannery O'Connor Award winner for short fiction, and also the author of today's book of reference, which is not fiction, Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I. Madero, and his secret book, Spiritist Manual. So let me now welcome C.M.Mayo. Hello, CM. How are you?
Well, I'm great, and I'm delighted to be on your show. Thank you so much.
Well, we are really delighted to have you, aren't
Yes,
we?
absolutely.
Kate? And your whole background is very interesting. You're calling us, I hope you don't mind me saying, from Mexico City, which is a place I've visited twice. Very interesting place to go. And also, you hail from El Paso, Texas, and you lived your early life in California, Southern California, but now you're living in Mexico City.
Actually, where I grew up was Silicon Valley in Northern California.
Oh, okay. Okay,
so
a little mistake
different
there.
Today than when I was a little kid, but yeah. So I'm a Californian culturally, but the Texans can claim me.
So your book is all about Francisco I. Madero. Now, I may not be pronouncing that in the correct way.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. Madero, you got it.
Okay. And he led a revolution in Mexico, and he was the president for approximately 3 years. Is that correct?
I think it was less than that. He led the 1910 revolution. And when we hear about the Mexican Revolution, that went on for a long time, several years actually. But he was the leader of the first spark of it, which was formally announced on November 20th. And after apparently winning that revolution, he did a second campaign for the presidency, won the election, and took office. And he held office for a very short period. Let's see, it would have been 1911, and then in February of 1913, he was murdered in a coup d'etat. And then at that point, the revolution just ground on with a lot of different chapters. And I think probably most listeners, even those who don't know Mexican history, have probably heard of Pancho Villa,
of course,
and Emiliano Zapata. And these were important actors in the revolution. At the beginning, in 1910, they allied with Francisco Madero, and Madero was recognized by all of them as the leader of the revolution. So at that point, so it's a long, messy, complicated episode, but
it certainly is. From reading the book, it is incredibly labyrinthian, and the way that these people knew each other, such intricately woven entanglements. I've
yeah.
never seen a better description of 6 degrees of separation. Only in this case, it's mostly about 2 or 3 degrees of separation.
Yeah, some of it was very fun to discover. Yeah.
It's your book was just amazing.
Thank you.
Now, the book really has like 2 parts, correct?
That's right. It's my book about his book, and it includes my translation of his book.
So the way the book comes off to me as your book, that's all about how it got, all about your journey and about his journey and all the people he knew and the way he died and all those various things. And then there's his book on Spiritism.
Right. And the funny thing is, it's got this mouthful of a title, Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution. A lot of people have laughed at that title, and I still love the title. I'm definitely married to that title, but it's an odyssey
It is.
about, how he came to lead the revolution because of his Spiritist ideas, his metaphysical philosophies. But it's also an odyssey for me in understanding this as his translator. And then finally, it's an odyssey, I hope, for the reader who may know nothing about metaphysical religion or may know nothing about him and the revolution and Mexico. So it's kind of an odyssey of understanding, and in his case, an odyssey that brings him to action in the revolution and finally his death.
Well,
so it's an odyssey in those 3 ways.
yes, I totally agree. You had an odyssey, he had an odyssey, and there was a spiritual odyssey in there as well, both historical and spiritual. I was very struck by your breadth of knowledge involving the history of spiritualism and spiritism and how you wove that into Masonic stuff and other kinds of metaphysical thought, even going to theosophy and Hinduism. So could you perhaps clarify for our listeners the difference between spiritualism and spiritism?
Yeah. Well, Spiritism, it's important to understand, is from spiritualism. So it really starts with spiritualism, which really starts in upstate New York.
Ah, yes.
And so round about the middle of the 19th century, I mean, at most histories of spiritualism, there's a U in there to distinguish it from spiritism, spiritualism. Most histories of spiritualism, and by the way, the one that's most frequently referenced is by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes.
Wow.
He was a great believer in spiritualism, and he wrote a standard history of it. And so that began with a lot of psychokinetic phenomena, and that kind of took its own path. And Madame Blavatsky showed up in the middle of all that, and that was the whole movement of theosophy, which kind of is related, but it's not the same thing. And then where this comes into our story with Francisco Madero. In Europe, they heard about this, about the spiritualism and about the phenomena in upstate New York, and there were a number of mediums. One of them was Didi Home, who was a Scot who had moved to the United States.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, really interesting guy, very interesting person. And he did tours, demonstration tours throughout Europe, oftentimes with the aristocracy, including emperors and empresses. And this got a lot of attention. And so there was a French educator who has a real mouthful of a name, and he's better known as Allan Kardec, but
Yes.
that's a pen name or a spiritist name. His actual name is, I'll see if I pronounce it right, Hippolyte Léon Denisard Rivel. I never
Better you than me.
French, so I'm sure my French teacher is laughing for the spirit world. Dizzy Lizzie, I gave you a D in French. But Allan Kardec, what he did was he was very excited by these phenomena, particularly particularly table tipping, where people would sit around a table and all hold hands to make sure nobody was cheating, I guess, and to raise the energy. And the tables would literally start to dance around. By the way, if you haven't seen that, you can find a bunch of them on YouTube. It's quite funny. But he got very excited by this and decided that this was the new frontier for science. And so the way that he decided to study this was, I like to make the analogy that as you might take a microscope to look at a leaf in detail, he worked through mediums to investigate the spirit world. So he did that. He interviewed the spirits through mediums and produced a literature. And the Book of the Spirits, the Book of the Mediums, and several other books. And this body of work by Allan Kardec is sort of the codification of Spiritism. And Spiritism is very similar to Spiritualism, but it goes into more detail, and it has a much closer idea, at least at that time, with reincarnation. I think nowadays it's more, things have evolved and they've become different, and people have their own ideas. And I think probably many spiritualists do believe in reincarnation. But at that time, there was a clear difference that the spiritualists didn't and the spiritists did, and the spiritists followed Allan Kardec. So it was Allan Kardec's works and some of his followers' works who came after him in the late 19th century that Francisco Madero discovered when he was a student in Paris. So that's kind of my long answer to your question.
Well,
helps.
Yes, it really does. And as you may remember from our email conversation, that I'm very interested, of course, in those folks from New York State and how, Dee Dee Home and the Fox sisters, and oddly, the founder of Mormonism or the Church of the Latter-day Saints, Joseph Smith, he lived in the same area in approximately the same era, not the same year. And it is also a hot spot for UFOs, that area of New York. Even as Kate knows, we were recently at, what was the name of that festival?
It was, now you got me offhand. Oh, I know. Pine Bush.
Pine Bush Festival, which is held every year in that area of New York State. And it's basically celebrating the sightings of UFOs. And it's a family fun day. And they try to make not fun of it, but have fun with it.
Yeah.
And in the evening, they have very serious speakers on the UFO topic. And it has been a hotspot for UFO activity right up until the current time. And there was a big flap of UFO activity, which was known as the Hudson
Valley Triangles, but that was 1980s. And
well, that was recent compared to the founding of the Mormon Church.
True. But, speaking of churches, I would imagine Mr. Madero grew up as a Catholic coming from Mexico.
Oh, yes.
And that must have been quite the switch for him then, right?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I listened to your recent podcast, which was so interesting, the one with Andrew Chestnut about La Santa Muerte, which is a very different thing than Spiritism. They're very different. And I hope we can talk about that and answer some questions about that later. There, Madero had nothing to do with the Santa Muerte, nothing.
No, I could imagine not.
But the thing is, what's very interesting about that, as he commented, is that many followers of the Santa Muerte, which is also the case with followers of Spiritism, and is also the case with many followers of the Niño Fidencio, which we can also talk about.
Interesting,
They identify, many of them, not all of them, but many of them self-identify as Catholics. And yet the Catholic Church prohibits all this stuff.
Strongly.
Definitely, these are not recognized saints. This is,
Well, isn't this a little bit akin to Santeria? That the people, the Santeria people, they consider themselves general Catholics, but then they have extra saints and lots of little figurines that I've seen in the Botanicas.
Call them Protestants and get it over with.
I think this is probably true all over the world, that there's different folk traditions that people follow that the church doesn't approve of, but they do anyway, and then they still show up at Mass and have the Virgin of Guadalupe and so on. So I think definitely the Madero family definitely considered themselves good Catholics, and
Yeah.
the children were educated in Catholic schools, and so on and so forth. So,
Well,
yeah.
well, they use that as certainly as a partially governmental control too, which I think also probably got him a little bit separated from the church.
I'm not sure I follow you.
Well, the church being so strongly regulatory among the working class and he seemed to champion the working classes, and he probably thought of the Catholic Church as detrimental to them because they were so strongly regulated and not really left to have a less regulated life, for want of a better word. I would think that, I don't know, perhaps I'm absolutely wrong. It seems that between Spiritism and Catholicism, in his mind, there was probably a schism.
Yeah, I would suspect there was.
The main difference really is that he, as he states in the Spiritist Manual, and this is really where the church has some trouble with it, is he says you do not need the ritual of the Mass.
Oh.
That you can commune with the divine and the astral directly.
I see.
You do not need to go to a priest. And so, his philosophy that he states in the Spiritist Manual, it's very similar to Catholicism in that the emphasis is on, being a good person and, all the kind of things you would hear in Sunday school, and the Lord's Prayer and all that kind of stuff. But, there's nothing very exotic in that regard. He's just basically saying it's important to be a good person, and this is what you have to do to be a good person, and charity and love your brother and all those things. But you don't need the Mass. Now, that goes directly against the Catholic Church. And they also feel that in the Catholic Church that communicating with spirits is diabolical. So
Could be. So they say.
So they say. So I think that was where the break was. I don't really know that it went I couldn't really speak to it in more detail. I think had he lived, I think he would have articulated a much more detailed philosophy of education and public education. And I think that he didn't really see this as just religious beliefs, but as science. This is the future.
I see. Okay.
He believed that what he was doing was scientific. So I think that had he lived, and had he politically been able to, he would have. My guess is he would have gone more against the Catholic Church on many different fronts, including education, but that didn't happen.
Well, what did happen, CM, and what was a fact that you wrote in your book, which is way off Catholicism, and I am not a Catholic, so I'm not offending myself, and if I don't expect that I'm offending most Catholics. This gentleman was a Freemason, and Freemasonry is kind of the Christian antithesis of Catholicism. I mean, when you go back to the time of Jacques de Molay and Joan of Arc and so forth, who laid the foundations during the Crusades for Freemasonry, it was directly against the Catholic Church, and they were burned at the stake. And even to this day, in suburban neighborhoods in the United States, the Knights of Columbus hate the Freemasons, and the Freemasons hate the Knights of Columbus. So it would seem, I don't mean that each and every one hates each and every one, but you know what I'm saying. They're fraternal organizations, for the most part, that tend to not care for one another. And you cannot be, to my knowledge, at least as of my childhood, be a member of the Catholic Church and a member of the Freemasons. And did not the Freemason Scottish Rite make a big fuss when Madero was killed?
They did. They did. And that was actually one of the most fun parts of my research. Was I went into the Library of the Temple in Washington, D.C., the one that's on 14th Street in the district. And they have a wonderful library there. And for anyone who hasn't been in there, it looks very foreboding. But you can just walk up, go in, and they'll give you a tour.
Huh.
I forget if you have to pay or not, but I mean, you can have a tour, and they have docents, and it looks like the set of a movie in there, like it's it's a replica of a antique temple. It's really wild, but they'll give you a tour. Anyone can walk in and have a tour. And by the way, I'm not talking about the one in Alexandria. That's a different one. This is the one that has the library, and it's on 14th Street in Washington, D.C. But they have the most wonderful library, and you can Google it up. It has a web page, and the librarian was incredibly helpful. And she brought out all the issues of the magazine where they were complaining bitterly, very angrily about the murder of Brother Madero. I think in Mexico, though, that it's a little tricky, and here's where I think it gets a little bit tricky in making generalizations about the Masons, because in Mexico in the 19th century they served in a way the role of political parties that, now they're regular old political parties, just like in the US. But back then, a lot of people organized themselves around these lodges instead of having a political party like a conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat. And here in Mexico, we have the PRI or the PAN or the PRD. But they would, at that time, congregate around lodges. And there was a lot of, I think one of the things that can confuse a lot of people is it's difficult to draw really firm conclusions about each person, because like we were talking before about theosophists. Madero knew people who were spiritists and theosophists and fellow Masons, but some were not. Some were just spiritists, and some were just theosophists or just Masons, or they were theosophists and Masons, but not spiritists. It's like a mosaic. It gets really confusing.
Were you going to say?
No, I was going to say, but that's true, generally speaking, with people who are serious philosophers. I mean, above all, he was a philosopher.
I would say so.
And, regardless of which path he was following, and a sincere one, too. He certainly came, as you point out, from a background of extreme wealth, and yet cared for people that worked with or for him, and developed a whole movement around that belief. So, and was assassinated for him.
Yes, it seems like a dark moment in U.S. history that I was really basically unfamiliar with, because the ambassador to Mexico was such a cowboy and a kind of a sort of narcissistic or sociopathic cowboy to add to it. His behavior and manner towards the whole situation did not seem to have any give to it to sort of kind of make all the people happy. He just wanted it was his way or the highway, and whoever died in between was just tough luck.
He was not a popular character. In fact, this is Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson, and he's one of the arch villains of Mexican history. I think that's a fair generalization to make, but he was quickly recalled. He had supported the coup d'etat and the general that murdered Madero. And so when the new administration came in, coincidentally, that was the Woodrow Wilson administration.
No relation.
Well, who knows? Maybe they were related at some point, but there was no overt relation that we know of. And it was just a coincidence that they have the same name. But President Wilson had him recalled and sent somebody else. So, but that is bitterly remembered by many Mexicans. Bitterly remembered. It was very interesting to read his memoirs. One of the things I really enjoyed in doing this book was just delving into the period and just going into all the things I could find in the memoirs of people who had witnessed things or lived through things or had known Madero. It was really fascinating.
It is a very, very complex book, and I would suggest that readers take a pen and paper and just make some notes and look up some of these people on the internet or in history books, because you really do have to really concentrate. It's very, very, very interesting, and as I had said, it's just a very intricately woven series of entanglements. And the one involvement that I was unaware of the scope of, and I have a little funny anecdote about this, is about the German involvement in Mexico in the late 19th century. I had no idea, and my little anecdote is simply that I have a car which is a Volkswagen, and it's a hybrid. It's a Jetta hybrid Volkswagen, not a very popular model, but I happen to like it. And it was made in Mexico, but a German motor was put in it. And unknowing all this history that I now know, it's funny because I call my little Volkswagen, I call her Linda Ronstadt.
Oh,
Because there's a German motor inside of a Mexican chassis.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
So, the German involvement in Mexico was astounding. I had absolutely no idea about that.
Well, I didn't either. I'm thinking in particular of Felix Sommerfeld and Arnold Krumheller. These were German agents who reported to the German ambassador, who were very close to Madero. And actually, I was enormously helped because in 2012, Heribert von Freilich brought out a book called In Plain Sight about Felix Sommerfeld that went into far more. Most historians of the Revolution were aware of the role of Felix Sommerfeld, but Heribert von Freilich really went in great detail and really did his research. And von Freilich is German. So, of course, he speaks German and can read German, which is a great impediment to most people who try to research that field because they run into German documents and can't read them. But he could, and he also has a background he has a master's degree in Latin American history. So he went into the archives and just pulled out the most magnificent book. And I got my hands on that just in time as I was writing my Madero book. So that just opened a lot of doors for me in understanding what was going on. And many of your listeners may be familiar with Arnold Krumheller. He's very well known in German and in Spanish for esoteric works published in the first part of the 20th century.
Interesting. I don't know. I haven't had too much knowledge of how many Spanish or Hispanic listeners we have, but we do have a number of German-speaking listeners. So they obviously also speak English. Otherwise, they'd be not listening to us.
Yeah.
I guess
Good point.
since we've had Santa Muerte on, I think maybe we've gained some Spanish-speaking listeners.
That was a really good show, by the way. I'm often asked that question, what's the relation with Spiritism? And I mean, I knew that there was no relationship, but I really couldn't have said much about it. So I was absolutely fascinated to listen to Professor Chestnut. He really knows his stuff. He's really done a very interesting work there.
I was really surprised as well. I did not think it was going to be that great a topic, but he was extremely impressive. And as I've mentioned at work today, a lot of the topics that have been written on, such as yours, are esoteric, and your average person is either scoffing or laughing at it, one or the other. But the people that write these books are so well read and so well spoken that I keep telling people you have to take this seriously, because these are not silly individuals that write about them, and it's very interesting topics.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I think this is the reason why. I mean, if you stop and think about it, the leader of this transformative episode in Mexican history, the 1910 Revolution, which is the first major revolution of the 20th century, wrote a book. And, United States, we share a nearly 2,000-mile border with Mexico, and we have many, many, many people studying the Mexican Revolution in the United States. I mean, almost every major university has a course on Mexican history or Latin American history, and that had never been translated. The book, in 100 years, the book had never been translated. So like, why? Why is that? And I think that's the answer to it, is that the people who did know that Madero was a spiritist were just very quick to dismiss it and say, oh, yes, but they couldn't actually tell you what Spiritism was or where it came from or what its literature was. They had no context for it. I mean, that said, I also must say, although I'm the first person to translate it that I know of, I was able to build my own argument, my own research on there is a handful of Mexican historians who have written seriously about the subject. Their books are hard to find, but they're really important and good books, and they were like a foundation for me to build my book on. Yolia Tortolero, she wrote El Espiritismo seduce a Francisco Madero. This was heavily researched in the National Archives. This was her doctoral thesis. She turned it into a book. It's a wonderful book. It's on Kindle. You can get it on Kindle. Yolia Tortolero. Manuel Guerra de Luna is another. Alejandro Rosas. Enrique Krause. There are Mexicans who've written about it, but I think it's a very difficult subject. And I was also really helped. I was very surprised to find, I waded through all the Allan Kardec books and the history of spiritualism books and, Madame Blavatsky, and I read all these things I could read. But I was delighted to find that there, over the last decade, or let's say last 15 years, maybe last 20 years, a number of people, with a profile similar to Professor Chestnut. They're professors of religion, professors of history, or professors of history or philosophy or something. Very distinguished academics have started to take these things seriously, which again isn't to say, oh, let's go believe in it or let's make fun of it, but to just say, well, it was what it was. Important people believed in it. Where did they get these ideas? Why did they think this? What was the literature? Let's look at the context. Let's look at the history. So, I'm not trying to tell anybody, oh, you must believe what Francisco Madero believed. I'm simply saying, well, this is what he believed, and this is where it came from, and this is the context. So, but even still, it's very hard. I don't have to tell you, right? Guys.
Well, we at Shattered Reality here, we have very strict feelings about beliefs in a certain sense. We try not to talk so much about beliefs, but rather what you experience, because apparently these people experienced things, and their philosophy was based on what they experienced, rather than blind belief because somebody told them that such and such was the doctrine.
But I think where people find it difficult is when certainly a belief or religion is one thing, and they'll respect that. But when you say something that I've channeled to my younger brother, and who is passed on, and it is he who is now directing my actions, that's when you start to lose people believing it, because most people do not experience that, and since they don't experience, how could you experience it? So if it isn't true for them, it's why should it be true for you? And it's the same with UFOs. I mean, people who have seen them totally, but I mean, that's the difference between seeing and believing. And for example, this man probably did channel his younger brother, who it seems silly to me because I've never channeled anybody, but to this man, it took it very seriously and it shaped his life.
Absolutely.
Well, that was certainly the case with Madero, that he was medium and he trained himself to channel by writing, and he started with his younger brother, and then he ended up getting other spirits who we know from his mediumistic notebooks, which have been preserved. They've been transcribed and published in Spanish. There were spirits that he was channeling, or let's say his perception apparently was that he was channeling these spirits, telling him how to proceed with his political campaign, how to proceed with the revolution itself, and then telling him, and you will write the Spiritist Manual.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people, when that comes up, no, for them, Madero's crazy. There's nothing more to say.
Yeah.
And what I find so interesting is if you can just get past having to conclude. I don't think you have. I never felt I needed to conclude one thing or the other. That I could just simply go in and say, well, okay, where did he get these ideas? Who were the other people that he was with that also have these ideas? And I had an enormous benefit from this literature I just mentioned, but also I was able to consult his personal library.
Nice.
And that's available to the public. It's at, any researcher can go there. It's at the Centro de Estudios de la Historia de Mexico here in Mexico City. But it's only been a few years that that's been available. The catalog is online, so you can check it out. But it was really an amazing thing to go and go through all his books and see, what was he reading, and, what was inscribed to him, and where had he made notes, and what did he cite in the Spiritist Manual. That was also really a revelation. A lot of Hindu philosophy came into the Spiritist Manual, and we could see that in his library. He had the Bhagavad Gita, he had the book of Swami Vivekananda, he had a lot of very esoteric stuff.
Wow, yeah. And you, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you mentioned Arthur Conan Doyle before. There's this show on television, Houdini and Doyle. I don't know if you've seen it, but Houdini and Doyle were contemporaries. And obviously this is fictional, but they play two characters where Houdini's the skeptic and Doyle is the believer. And last night's episode had Thomas Edison on.
Wow.
Thomas Edison had tried to invent a necrophone,
Yes,
where he communicated through various
That's
electromagnetic waves with the dead. And now there was a man who had belief and then tried to prove it, which sometimes can be really hard.
Yeah. Well, it is an outgrowth of the spiritualist movement. I think that Thomas Edison, we don't think of him in that fashion. And right here, in the United States, we had Nancy Reagan, who was a consulting astrologist, and some people said that she was kind of running things. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, and I don't care, but it is a fact of American history when people sort of think that Americans don't do this sort of thing. Well, they're sadly mistaken. But to bring back our talk to Latin America and to the Spiritist movement, you had mentioned Arrigo and Juan de Dios, John of God, to most people listening to this, and they're both people that I have been very much interested in. And one of our guests is also a big fan of Arrigo. That's David Biedny. Is very fond of Arrigo as a historical figure and an impressive character. What is the relationship between Spiritism and healing, particularly psychic surgery?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. From what I could see, Madero's concepts of healing were hands-on, just hands-on healing, hypnotism. He was really interested in hypnotism. That many books of French books on hypnotism were in the library. Homeopathy. He was also a practicing homeopathist. But the psychic surgery, Madero did not do. That said, I am aware that there are a lot of spiritists in the Philippines and Brazil that do the psychic surgery. And so that was actually one of the things that was really fun in researching this book, was just to give it context. I was kind of reading in to see, well, what was there in Mexico of that? And the two great figures, there's three great figures that come forth that I don't think really had anything much to do with Madero. There's a very incidental thing, which I'll mention in a moment, but and that would be Niño Fidencio, who died in 1938, and he's a revered figure among many people in the North and in Texas. Teresa Urrea, which some of you may have heard of because she's the subject of Luis Alberto Urrea's novel, The Hummingbird's Daughter. She was his great aunt. And she was from the north of Mexico and ended up in Arizona, well, also Texas, and died very young. And the other one is Doña Pachita, who was active up to the 1970s. So there are some well-known psychic surgeons in Mexico, but they weren't necessarily spiritists. The connection with Niño Fidencio is really interesting, and this is something I hope, I don't think it's going to be me, but I hope someone will do the research here. Niño Fidencio was a worker on a ranch, a very humble person, and he was encouraged by a spiritist whose name was Teodoro von Wernich, a German Mexican who was a friend of Madero's. They were both Masons and they were both spiritists. And Teodoro von Wernich was kind of a mentor to Niño Fidencio. So Niño Fidencio did not consider himself spiritist, but he was a mediumistic healer. And later, President Elias Calles, Plutarco Elias Calles, who was a couple of presidencies after Madero, he ended up going to Niño Fidencio, and he was also, Calles was a spiritist. So there's a lot of interesting little connections to explore.
Is it just for the record, because I really want to know, would you consider John of God or Arrigo spiritists?
My understanding is that they are that they're spiritist healers. That's my understanding.
Okay. It's just I hadn't thought of it in quite that way, but I don't know that it's not true. So I was kind of being interested in both of those persons. John of God, of course, is still alive to my knowledge,
Mhm.
and Arrigo has passed away about 100 years ago, I'm guessing. And he was purportedly channeling Dr. Fritz, as I recall it, who was purportedly also a German doctor.
Well, and in
So,
the Philippines as well, I think that there's a very strong spiritist psychic healing thing. One of the things that's really interesting to me about Doña Pachita, who, as I say, was active up into the 70s, was that a lot of people my age, I'm in my 50s, and people my age and a little bit older remember being in the room when she was. I mean, I'm just surprised how many people have said, oh, they'll read my book and they'll say things like, I was there when she operated on so and so, or they'll say to me, oh, she cured my grandmother. It's been really interesting. And that also brings me back about what we were talking about earlier, of how many people just, they kind of shut off their mind at the mere mention of this stuff. It's just, they're just like, no, this is crazy. I don't want to hear about it. But what I find oftentimes is that there are people who act like they're not interested or it's ridiculous, but then in private, they'll tell me things like,
Yeah.
she cured my grandmother, or I was there when she operated, and stuff like that. So I find that really interesting.
well,
It's like people are there. I think people know that there are debunkers out there that are just going to rip them to shreds and humiliate them, and they don't want to they don't want to run that risk, and I can understand that.
Well, we here at Shattered Reality like to look at the idea of scientism, that is, science, materialistic science as a religion in itself, and that maybe those people might be on the wrong path because they don't actually give true science, which is an open minded approach to things that might be going on and looking at such things. So we here at Shattered Reality try to burst a few bubbles in that direction. And I will add to that note that being a person who reads cards and palms and so forth for part of the time of my life, I find that people say, oh, I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. Do you want to read my palm? Do you want to read my palm? Like I'm dying to, but I don't believe in that. But maybe you want to read my palm, So it's like,
Oh
right.
dear. Oh dear. Oh. Yeah. Well, I think we're at a really interesting moment because there's a book that just came out that I just reviewed it with a long essay about my book in reviewing this book, and I hope this is someone you might have on your show. It's Jeffrey Kripal.
Oh, yes. He's a fascinating fellow. As a matter of fact, I just saw him at the SSE.
Oh, fabulous. Well, so I don't have to tell you about it. It's called The Supernatural, and it's
Tell our listeners anyway, because they may not know.
I'm sure listeners have all heard of Whitley Strieber, who wrote Communion and all those books about
Alien
his perception of what may or may not have been alien abduction. But Jeffrey Kripal is a very distinguished academic, a historian of religion. And he took Whitley Strieber's book Communion as a mystical text. And it's an absolutely fascinating book written by both of them, interchanging chapters. And it really struck a note with me because I encountered a mystical text. And that was Madero's Spiritist Manual.
Indeed.
And my way of addressing that text and addressing readers who, bringing readers into considering what implications this might have and thinking about not only reality, but the revolution itself. That, the main leader of the revolution wrote this book, was what Kripal calls the Kantian cut. And I didn't use that term, but basically what it is to say, look, our brain is limited in what it can perceive. You know, we take vibrations and turn them into perceptions of color or sound or
Exactly.
taste, but we're limited in what we actually perceive. And once you understand that, which is just a sort of obvious, commonsensical conclusion, you have to realize, well, it could well be that there are a lot of things I just cannot perceive. So it's really ridiculous to say, well, I'm
Yeah.
only going to believe what I can see or hear or smell. Which is what oftentimes people who buy into scientism do. They say, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist. Well, like, excuse me, that's pretty ridiculous, you know, because of course there's ultraviolet and there's gamma rays and there's microwaves, and you can't see those things either. But don't tell me they don't exist. So I think this is such a wonderful book, The Supernatural by Kripal and Whitley Strieber, that it kind of opens up thinking about these subjects for people who otherwise might not just psychologically or emotionally or intellectually be able to otherwise, because they haven't experienced things. I mean, I understand what you're saying, that if you've experienced something, if you say, well, you know, I channeled so-and-so, then if somebody else says that, you're more likely to believe it. But if you haven't, you can't. You're just like, no, that person must be nuts because I haven't experienced that. But well, anyway, the thing is that I think the way Kripal presents it's an invitation for many people who wouldn't otherwise to consider these things. And in considering these things, you don't necessarily have to believe or not believe. You can simply consider. You look at context, you look at history, you look at compare and contrast, and suddenly you can learn so much without necessarily saying, I believe this or I believe that. I don't have to say, I believe Madero was channeling his brother. I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't in his head. What do I know? But I can say, well, it looks like that's what he apparently believed. And therefore, we can come to some really interesting conclusions about political action and the revolution that otherwise would have been completely opaque to us.
Well, how has this affected you personally? Do you feel like you've been more open to supernatural, or had you been before you started researching this man?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think it's just made me really humble in the sense that I, you know, I have the confidence to tackle whatever subject I want, but I'm humble about what I might actually conclude from it, and the idea that there might be more that I don't understand.
Yeah.
So, you know, I've tried to bring forth as a translator, as a writer, something new, or built upon the Mexican historians who've previously written about it. You know, I've added to that and built upon it. And brought something new that I think really does show us something very different about the Mexican Revolution. But I think that's always going to be true, that there's this other level. And actually, Fahrusha, I wanted to mention, I found your blog through the blog roll of Frank DeMarco.
Oh, yes, I know Frank.
And what's really amazing to me is I was reading his recent blog posts, and, you know, he's been, for people who are not familiar with Frank DeMarco, he's been channeling Rita and his friend Rita, who's passed on, who was a fellow.
I knew Rita too. Yeah, I met Rita. I shouldn't say I knew her because it was just an acquaintance, but what a wonderful woman.
Well, here's what's really interesting to me about it. And I'm not trying to say for sure that's what's happening or it's right or it's wrong. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in Frank's head. I didn't know Rita. I don't know. But here's what's really interesting to me. In these blog posts, he's bringing through a far more complex model or paradigm of what is the afterlife and what is reincarnation than what we've seen before. And so what I mean to say with this is simply that there's always another level. There are always new questions. There's always something that's going to be revealed that we didn't know before. So how we think about anything, whether it's reincarnation or whether it's the Mexican Revolution or the Roman Empire or, you know, the planets of the solar system, or, you know, or how dogs think, whatever you want, there's going to be some new level. And it's just ridiculous to think that, you know, I'm going to understand everything right now in 2016. All I can do is understand it as best I can and explain it as best I can. But then someone will build on my work, and someone may write something else about Francisco Madero and Spiritism and the Revolution. So it kind of rolls on.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does.
CM, what I would ask you is that, and this, I don't want this to sound like a criticism because it really is not a criticism, but you seem to feel as though maybe because other people have encouraged you in this way that you need to draw conclusions. You have several times said that I don't really want to draw a conclusion. Well, I can only say to you that I think you're a fabulous researcher. I read your book with really with rapt attention, and you do have to pay attention to your book because it is so meticulous and it could take you down so many different alleys. But who is it that told you you had to draw a conclusion? Because you keep saying I don't have to draw a conclusion when it's Kate and I would never ask you to draw such a conclusion.
Well, I often, when I present the book, I get people who insist that I tell them whether I believe that he was actually channeling this person, or if I believe in this or believe in that. I do draw a conclusion, though, and I do ask the reader to come to a certain point, and that is to acknowledge that he was, in fact, a spiritist, and what that meant, what the context of that was, and that although the reader may or may not believe in those ideas, that Madero was a very intelligent person with a lot of capabilities, and his government didn't last. It was overthrown. But I think in any revolution, the new government's going to be weak by definition, or there wouldn't have been a revolution. Right. So there are often counter-revolutions that come in right away. So the fact that his government didn't last long and he was murdered, I don't think that necessarily says anything about his character or his abilities. I think it would have been difficult for anyone to maintain the government in that circumstance. And in fact, the guy who overthrew him didn't last very long either. So it was a constant turmoil for a very long time. But I do ask the reader to go that far, to simply acknowledge it and to respect its context.
And speaking of the reader, we definitely have to announce your book again.
Yes,
we've been remiss in that.
And they can get it on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and other booksellers?
Yes, absolutely. It's in paperback and Kindle.
Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I. Madero, and his secret book, Spiritist Manual.
And written by
C.M.Mayo, who is our wonderful guest today. But I will ask you one final question before we allow you to go upon your merry way and have dinner in Mexico City and fiesta, etc. We hope. In any case, the final sort of question I have, I drew the conclusion from what you said, maybe incorrectly, that you had seen an iteration of the Marfa Lights.
Oh yes, I've seen.
So tell us about that, please.
Oh yeah,
I didn't know about that.
I'm doing a book about Far West Texas right now, and Marfa sits right in the middle of Far West Texas. It's an area that's there's very little population, and the lights have been seen. They were seen by Apaches. They've been documented for a very long time. Yeah, I saw them on several occasions. It's pretty amazing to see. It really is. They're definitely different. And in doing my book, I went and interviewed several people in Marfa, and I would just pretty much ask everybody I talked to at the end of the interview, have you seen them? And pretty much everybody. And they all have different stories. And it's really a curious phenomenon. It really is something unusual.
So how did you get into this field? I mean, these books are like, as Fahrusha said, meticulously researched. That's a lot of work, a lot of time. How did you come to do this?
Well, I like to read. I like to research. I'm happy to sit at my desk and read. So I like to. I like looking at places that I'm a very curious person. I always have a lot of questions about things. So I like to go and see places, and I love to be able to interview people, which is why I did this book. I'm doing a book now in Far West Texas because the book I did on Madero, mostly I was just sitting by myself, translating and reading. And I really wanted to talk to people. So, living people. So, so it was a great excuse to do that. And I love as a writer being able to talk to people that I might not meet otherwise, or that they wouldn't necessarily be so forthcoming with me in a social environment. But if I come and interview them, like I interviewed a guy who runs a barbecue joint and a rodeo racer and a barrel racer and the Marfa. Speaking of the Marfalites, I interviewed the guy with the local rack shop. He had a lot of Marfalite stories. So, it's really, I love just all kinds of people, just talking to them and listening to them.
So you've become a kind of ethnographer, the Studs Terkel of West Texas, would we say?
Well, maybe to some degree I would emulate that to some degree, but the book I'm doing right now is going to be more like the book I did on Baja California, which is a travel memoir, but it also weaves in a lot of interview and history and cultural things. So it's a personal travel memoir, but it's meant to have the structure of a novel. And have so it could be read 10 years later, and a person could get a lot out of it.
Speak the name of it, CM, so people can get it.
That book is called, it's got a funny title. It's called Miraculous Air, Journey of 1,000 Miles Through Baja California, the Other Mexico. That's that 1,000-mile long peninsula that belongs to Mexico that hangs off of San Diego. So that's what that book is about. So the book I'm doing now is about far west Texas. So I meant it to be sort of a companion book to the book on Baja California. But it's involving a lot of reading. So I'm doing a lot of reading. But it's and it's also a story about northern Mexico, because of course Texas used to be part of Mexico. So it's still, in a way, I'm still writing about Mexico.
It's very, very, very interesting. You're writing on these various subjects, and maybe you'll become, was it the Paul Thoreau of the Southwest? I'm trying to think of literary comparisons. I'm sorry, I'm
you can't. She's in a
class by herself. Well,
Yes,
certainly
absolutely.
her research is in a class by its own.
Yeah, really, it's very fascinating, and it's great that, as we've sort of said before, that you bring up these various topics. It's important that people start to discuss them, and very much so. It just sort of adds to the quality of life. It expands your way of thinking about things, and maybe not so cut and dry, and it tends to make life a little bit more interesting and a little bit more livable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think if I could kind of end with an invitation to the listeners, which is I think that oftentimes in the U.S. there are many people who do know a lot about Mexico, that's for sure. But I think that a lot of people think they know more than they do, because their images of Mexico are so present in the media, and they're very present with advertising from the tourist industry. So there's this image of Mexico that we get in the U.S. And there are also, I think, a lot of ideas that come from the past, even going back to rivalries between England and Spain. They go into the deep past, that come with enduring presumptions, to use a term of my favorite historian, John Tutino. But I think actually there's a lot more there. It's a very rich and very complex tapestry of culture and history. And there's a lot more than I think most people would guess. And I've been here over 25 years, and I'm learning something new every day. I'm just continually amazed by big things I learn every day. So it's just never ending. But the richness and the complexity of Mexico is what I'd really like to invite listeners to consider and explore and become curious about.
Again, it's past the stereotype and into the reality. And it's the same thing as people stereotype things like Spiritism, and then when they read about it, they get into the reality of it. So, yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think the perception of Mexico is really badly colored now by present day politics. But, the reality of it is people in both countries probably don't really care about the politics.
Well, I would compare what you're saying about the variety of Mexico and the lack of understanding in this country about the variety, if the way that we as Americans, and I'm generalizing here because I don't think this way necessarily, but we think about Mexican food, all we think about is enchiladas and tacos and burritos. And if you go to the different areas of Mexico, you see what a vast different kinds of cuisines there are, and just in that little area, it's sort of like a microscopic version of the whole situation, because there's such a wonderful variety of Mexican cuisine that you can dine on in Mexico.
Yeah, that's really true. That is so true.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, so enjoyable. I appreciate it.
C.M.Mayo, Metaphysical Odyssey into the Mexican Revolution, Francisco I. Madero, and his secret book, Spiritist Manual. Thank you, C.M.
Yeah,
Thank you. It was a delight and an honor. Thank you so much.
Same here.
Bye now.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So, Kate, wasn't that interesting? Because it sort of brought together all this
I haven't hung up
history.
yet. Should I hang up?
Yeah, I guess
hang on.
we're just
wrapping
sort of
up.
concluding our show notes, and we're going to talk about our future stuff. But we really appreciate your
We were
help.
waiting for you to hang up to really say
well,
what we
'cause
thought.
I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but
Not at all.
what's recorded for the show. I just want to say thank you so much.
Okay, well, we thank you.
And have a great evening.
Well, and one last question for you. I would love to put this on my website. So, do you have an idea when it would be out?
Well, we generally get things out within 2 to 3 days.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, you're fast.
That's Bill.
No.
And thank you to you can say a big thank you to our wonderful engineer, Bill.
Oh, Bill, thank you. I do my own podcasts and I take forever because, oh my gosh, I'm really slow. Oh, well, thank you. Well, golly, I will keep an eye out and I'll be sure to put it on my blog and website and all that.
Well, let us know, and
Oh.
we will put your blog up as well.
Oh,
Okay, then. Well,
Well,
thanks.
thank you. Okay.
And
well, up till soon.
okay. Hasta la
Bye.
vista.
Hasta la vista. Bye.
So, as I was saying, this was very educational, and it just is nice to think about how ideas about the supernatural and the paranormal and the spiritual, if you will, can shape historical context.
Yeah.
Something that
yeah.
people do. I mean,
And
you
the
say,
religious? I mean, come
well,
on.
religion is kind of a lot clearer. A lot of wars are fought over religion. But when it comes to these kind of more esoteric philosophies, we don't necessarily consider how they might affect our own history, and who knows what Nancy Reagan was told by the astrologer, for instance. And I'm not picking on poor Nancy, but it's that kind of thing.
No. Well, he had a relatively successful presidency.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So in any case, well, this shows maybe the astrologer knew something.
He may be. Missed the one big thing though. Beware the odds of whatever it was.
Yeah, bang bang.
Yeah.
In
Other
any
than that,
case,
she was okay.
In any case, we have shattered some reality here again today, and we are looking forward to some very excellent guests that I may have gotten vis-a-vis the
SSE.
Society for Scientific Exploration Symposium, and I say that fast 15 times.
And talk about being put down. That is consistently put down by the
materialist, mechanistic, scientism world, the 19th century paradigm of the universe, which has been proven not so.
No, it's just useful though, and
It's useful to,
like inventing, internal combustion engine, antibiotics, things like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
but you can't have it be a
making these
religion.
people live long enough to study things so that they can.
Disprove it.
But yeah.
But as
Self-defeating, I
as
guess, in a
Max
way.
Planck said, consciousness is fundamental.
Yeah, perhaps he knows something.
You think so? You think he had
Marx,
something going on there?
Yeah, I don't know.
In any case, before we go on ad nauseum here, let's say goodbye.
Oh, okay.
And we are
Shattered
Shattered Reality. Good night.
Tally-ho.